Thank you for tuning in this evening, and thank you for coming this evening. Tonight, we're going to be talking about the Mayflower Compact. And what's interesting about the Mayflower Compact is a lot of us, when we had this in history class or in civics class, it was a question on a quiz or a test, and it kind of got glossed over a bit. And there's really a lot of substance in the Mayflower Compact. And it fits right in with what I would say is being an American, so to speak. And with Americans, I really like talking to people that weren't born here, weren't raised here, and to try to get their perspective. What do you think about, the average American, so to speak? And there's a guy I work with. He is from Macau. He's Chinese, and he's been in the States for about 15 years. And I asked him this question just the other day. And one of the things he talked about was, Americans talk a lot about freedom. He's like, I hear that a lot. And he spent a lot of time in Texas. So you can imagine, talk about freedom in Texas, right? So I said, I have a theory. I have a theory on that with Americans. And he, of course, wanted to know what my theory was. And I said, with Americans, freedom is in our blood, is what I said. It's in our blood. And why is it in our blood? It's because that no matter who you are, if you've been here for any length of time, there's something that brought you here that makes you just a little bit more special and maybe appreciate freedom a lot more than the average world citizen. Some of your ancestors came here because they were escaping tyranny. Some came here because they sought religious freedom. Some people were forced to come here through slavery. And those slaves, even if they didn't get their freedom, or even if they didn't escape, they had this desire to get away, a desire to be the people that they wanted to be. Other people are risk takers and profiteers, seeking fame and fortune. Some people were explorers, and I'm sure that the list that I have up there, I'm sure it's not all inclusive, but we just have something, all of us, something in our genetics runs through us that makes us desire something more and to be our own people. And where did that come from? How did that come about? Why are we that way? And what does the Pilgrims and the Mayflower have anything to do with that? In order to tell the story, we actually have to go back a ways. I like this slide. How did we get here? How did we get here in our situation of self-governance that we're in now? If you go back 1,000 years, we had what was called the divine right of kings. So a king had all the power. The king, in the king's view and other people's view, he was appointed by God. And so therefore, whatever he said was essentially what God said. And so he had all the power. And so there on the left side, you'll see the pyramid. You had God, then the monarch, then the nobles. It says people. I like to say peasants. We're the peasants, right? Well, maybe not Greg. Greg seems more like a noble, doesn't he? But the rest of us, we're the people. And that's the way it was. Now, we're in a situation where we have a government that is the consent of the governed. So we have a say in things. we get to choose our leaders. We get to vote. And so how do we get from there to here? And essentially this diagram here, it's more of the same thing. So in the Middle Ages, this is what we had. We had the Pope and the church at the top, and then it just goes down from there. And so in a situation of absolute power, the people make no choices over their own government. But then something came about, something happened. Back in the 1200s, 1215, we had the Magna Carta. Well, it wasn't us, it was the English. So the English at the time, the same thing, the divine right of kings, the king got to levy taxes, fight wars, collect the money, and the nobles and the barons, they were kind of getting sick and tired of it. I mean, imagine that. People are the same, right? We don't like heavy taxes levied upon us today. The barons, they didn't like it back then. And there was almost a rebellion there. And so as a somewhat of a compromise, the Magna Carta was drafted. And this was primarily a financial agreement between the king and the nobles. And so how was this the first step into becoming what we are today? Well, the main reason was because this began the erosion of the divine right of kings. The barons, the non-monarchs, they had a say in things. Now, the peasants still didn't have a say, but somebody other than the monarch had a say, and it put on paper that the king did not have absolute power. And that was extremely important. The king did not have absolute power. And so over time, in the tradition of the English, through English common law, this just came through their culture. It was embedded in their culture that the king was a limited monarchy, not an absolute monarchy. So what about these pilgrims in this Mayflower Compact? Who were the pilgrims? So the pilgrims were Puritans. Well, what's the difference between a pilgrim and a Puritan? So the Puritans, they wanted to purify the Anglican Church. So the Anglican Church in the Puritans' eyes had problems, and they wanted to try to solve those problems and make the Anglican Church what they thought it should be. The Pilgrims, on the other hand, and they weren't called Pilgrims at the time, but the people that we will finally know as Pilgrims, they were separatists. They wanted to be separate from the Church of England. And so that's what they started to do. What the mainstream Puritans and separatists would do, they believed in this concept called the congregational way. And the congregational way was they felt that the congregations should have autonomy. Congregations should choose their own leaders. The congregations could enter into friendly brotherhoods with other congregations. This was not something that the Church of England approved of. They did not like this. We can appreciate from our point of view, the congregational way. It makes sense to us. Church of England did not like this. And so what was happening? These Puritans would be meeting in secret, but sometimes they would get discovered by the Church of England, the different leaders of the Church of England. Sometimes they risked imprisonment. They risked home searches, sometimes death. And so it finally got to a point where the separatists wanted to leave England. And so that's what they did. In the early 1600s, they left England and they established themselves in Holland. This was in 1608. Their desire was to maintain their English culture. They wanted to continue to be Englishmen and English women, but not be under the English rule. This worked out for a short time, but eventually, as you can imagine, they were being influenced by Dutch culture. They did not like being influenced by the Dutch culture, and they didn't like their children being influenced by the Dutch culture. And so what do you do? So eventually they decided we should go to the New World. We can go to the New World and establish our own separatist colony away from Europe and away from England. So how do you get there? Well, they needed to be able to get to the New World via businessmen. So colonies that were established in the New World were done through different businesses. And so what they did is they negotiated agreements with merchants to fund their trip to the New World. They would be sailing to the New World with people that weren't pilgrims, that weren't separatists, with this agreement that they would ship, they would go to the New World and they would ship things back to England and repay their debts. And so that was the agreement. And the idea was there was going to be two ships that would sail for the New World, the Mayflower and the Speedwell. And after two failed attempts, only one ship, the Mayflower, set sail for the New World. How many have ever heard of the Speedwell?
It sounds vaguely familiar, but it's not very famous.
Exactly. The Speedwell, if you are even familiar with it, tried to leave England twice and took on water, and then they brought it back in. So the Pilgrims and whoever else was on the Speedwell, they spent 6 weeks trying to leave England. So on day one, they've been at sea 6 weeks and they had went nowhere. So it was a pretty rough go. So they ended up crowding onto the Mayflower, and then they set sail. The voyage over. Some of the leaders of the Pilgrims, John Carver, he would become one of the first governors, William Brewster and William Bradford. They began on September 16th of 1620. And if you notice, there was 102 people, but only 41 were pilgrims. They weren't all pilgrims. So the pilgrims, they called these non-pilgrims strangers, called them the strangers. So they called themselves the saints. So it was the saints and the strangers. Interestingly enough, there were at least 2 expectant mothers aboard. Now, for the mothers that are here listening, can you imagine getting on a boat over in England? By the time it's leaving, one of them was about 7 months pregnant. You kind of know that the baby's going to be on the way during the trip, and they did it anyway. They made that choice anyway. There was a baby born on the Mayflower on the way over. And then there was another baby that was born once the Mayflower arrived. So what's going on with that husband? I kind of wonder that too. What's getting his wife onto that boat? Nevertheless, that's what they did. And their destination was to Virginia. The Virginia colony was pretty big at that time. And their final destination was supposed to be at the mouth of the Hudson River. They didn't make it. Storms pushed them further north, and they landed close to Cape Cod. And they were unable to go further than that. So they decided this is where we're going to stay. The problem was the original contract was that they would land in Virginia. And so the strangers declared, this contract here is null and void. We're not in Virginia. We don't need to abide by any of these rules. Something tells me there must have been an attorney that was aboard at that
Who are
time.
the strangers?
The non-pilgrims. All apologies to any attorneys that might be present, but you can take it. But yes, the original contract was land in Virginia. They weren't in Virginia. And so mutiny threatened the situation and a solution was needed. So what was the solution? The solution was the Mayflower Compact. So what was this Mayflower Compact? It wasn't a lengthy constitution. It was only about 200 words. But in those 200 words, it was an agreement for rule between the Pilgrims and the strangers. And if you think about it, both the Pilgrims and the strangers came from a tradition. They already came from a tradition where the king did not have absolute power. At the same time, they were separated by an ocean between themselves and England. And they were also outside of the Virginia jurisdiction. And so they decided that they would declare that they would enter into a civil body politic and they would enact just and equal laws. And they also said that they would submit themselves to those laws. And that's very important. This is where we say that the Mayflower Compact was America's first constitution. It was put down in paper and they submitted themselves to that. They submitted themselves to that law, that constitution. It wasn't actually a law, but it was a bit of a constitution. So what was the impact of the Mayflower Compact? Well, just as we just said, the first written constitution in the New World. We still had things going on down in Virginia back in 1620. Virginia in 1619, they had the first representative government with their House of Burgesses. But all of their agreements up to that point in time, it was mostly economic. Whereas with the Pilgrims were religious. And it was also, they had the non-religious strangers that they had to get along with. And so this is where having this contract in place that everyone could, that everyone agreed to was put down on paper. This model up in New England also furthered the concept of the consent of the governed. So the people were able to pick their own leaders and be governed by their own leaders. Now, the separatists, the Pilgrims, they had this as a tradition in their own churches. If you remember when we talked about earlier, when they were meeting in secret, they believed in this congregational way, this right, this ability to pick their own church leaders. This is just another evolution of that, only in civil society. So they were picking their own leaders. This is also again, more of an erosion of the king's power over the people and the divine right of kings. And especially the geography helped too. The king was thousands of miles away over in England. They had to do something, and the pragmatic approach was the Mayflower Compact. What this paved the way for was the town hall model of democracy, which was different than what the Virginians were doing with their representative model. So, and it's kind of interesting how both models evolved. They were both democracy, but they were democracy in different ways. The town hall model was more of a direct type of democracy, whereas the Virginians, they adopted the representative democracy relatively quickly. And so what did we have? After this happened, there were more and more colonies that were being established in New England, and there were more groups that were coming to New England for religious freedom. So those that were being persecuted in some way back in England, they were seeking religious freedom. They came to New England, and over time, there were several different religious groups that had come there and formed colonies. In 1630, the Massachusetts Bay Colony was established, and it was operating under a royal charter with leaders being chosen in London. So what do you have? You had two different models happening. You have the people in the Plymouth colony, the Pilgrims, they have their own people that they chose. And then you have these people in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. They have leaders, but these leaders are supposed to be meeting in London, being chosen by the company in London. And then the management is supposed to happen over in the New World. They quickly realized not going to work. And so the Massachusetts Bay Colony adopted a similar thing, what the Pilgrims were already doing, and that was choosing the leaders amongst ourselves and governing from the colony instead of governing from England. The Plymouth colony eventually merged with the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1691, and 85 years later or so, a new nation was born. That is the United States of America. When I look at all of this and I start doing the tracing as we're talking about in schematics, as we trace through, you cannot help but kind of see you can see a divine providence that's going on here. When you think about where we are today and where we've come from, does that mean that, there is divine providence in causing the storm to have the Pilgrims land up in Massachusetts instead of Virginia? We don't know, probably won't ever know. But when we see the impact of that and other things, and all of the things that came out of that, even later, you look at the United States, or you look at the Declaration of Independence and the US Constitution, what do we see? We see the religious freedom in Amendment 1. We have the religious freedom. Why? Because we have our tradition with the Mayflower Compact.